Let's talk some baseball with the London series this weekend. We figured we'd get the take from London, right, Jeff? Sound good?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Let's bring on Doug Glanville, who is over there to call the game on Sunday night, Phillies Mets. Have you adjusted to the flight and the time yet?
Probably not. Yeah, I'm just sort of like I'm just rolling with it. I try to act like okay, I just wake up at a new kind of 6 o'clock and just kind of go with it. But then you kind of like pass out somewhere on a street corner in the middle of the day because you're not sure where you are. But yeah, it's all good. I have 4 kids, so I've had sleep schedules that were just rumors. They were vicious rumors, and I just try to channel that in this moment.
From the short time that you've been there, what's been the experience like that baseball is now in London?
I mean, it's wild. I think, one thing that's really crystallized that I have a good amount of family here because my dad was from Trinidad and Tobago, and 2 of my uncles went to England for almost like 2 decades, and their daughters or their oldest they're both here in London and actually in England. So from that standpoint, I remember talking to my cousin Kim, and we were just like, she's like, you always said you'd come visit, and you kind of believe maybe baseball was going to be part of that, right? So, and it was like kind of a long shot because they're like, well, there's cricket, there's a lot of other sports that seem to be higher on the pecking order here, but it happened, and it's pretty cool. Like we're near a mall where we're staying, and it's called the Westfield Mall. So I went down there and was walking around, and there was a Lego store. So I started talking to one of the sales reps because my daughter loves Harry Potter. So I was like, okay, let's look at this stuff. And somehow we started talking about, why am I here? And she's like, oh, baseball. I know American football, and they keep chipping away. And now it's kind of familiar. It's like maybe baseball will have the same success. So she at least had like some familiarity that, it was coming. She, not necessarily her number one sport, but the idea was interesting, even though cricket, is obviously the similar thing that's bigger. So I've found it like an open door. I think I like the fact that MLB is trying to expose themselves to different countries and nations, many of which people do have some sort of connection to. Whether it's my time in Trinidad and England and my family, Tim Kirchin's family, his mom originated here, so there's a lot of possibility, and I think it's fun to be part of it.
It's the league's third visit there in the past 5 years, and they're going again in 2026. So clearly, they're trying to expand the international market. I'm curious. Have you heard any thoughts about the stadium? It's the West Ham soccer venue in the Premier League, and baseball put out a really cool time lapse of transforming this soccer stadium into a baseball field. Have you heard anything about that yet?
Well, I walked over there when I first got here. Now I didn't like go inside, but like I said, I'm not a big soccer fan per se, but I learned a lot from Ted Lasso. So from that, I was like, oh, West Ham. I've heard of West Ham. So it's like all there. And of course, I've talked to my cousin today, and she explained like you literally buy tickets if you can get them to these events, and you cannot sit in any section other than your section. Like that's just it. You may not make it out alive if you don't sit in your section. So it's deep here, and so I wonder, baseball. Yeah, we have rivalries. It's not quite that though. But it's fun to be kind of part of it. And I've traveled around a lot by train already, and I've seen, I've learned a little about Arsenal and the Spurs and Man U, and so I've kind of seen some of these venues already. Pretty cool.
You're now seeing the team with the best record in baseball. Is that something that you thought as this season was embarking, that the Phillies would have this record at this point and be this dominant?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I picked them to win it. Oh yeah, I mean, I picked them to win the division, and it's easy to go with the Braves, and it's like, all right. But I looked at this team. I was like, wait a minute. Okay, so they have a rotation that's deep. They have a bullpen that can get you out a million different ways: lefty, righty, power, sinker, changeup dudes. You have a lineup that's a nice mix of young guys that have like World Series experience, and now they're taking that next step. And you have the veterans, the Swervers, the Harpers, and you have a very good culture with Rob Thompson and the ability to kind of let them lead. I thought it was a perfect formula. There was no real holes in that team. I was looking at, and the numbers bear it out, right? You could have a top ERA on the starter side, and you could score the most runs per game, and you can, it's like, I don't know, maybe defense sort of. I mean, but this team is like loaded, and their only enemy is just, being healthy, like it is for a lot of teams. But they are, they're just so versatile and just a dominant team.
Even if I thought they'd be good, I didn't think they'd have an 8-game lead over the Braves in early June. With the rotation, I'm curious, as somebody who's stood in that outfield behind pitchers that have had rough days, pitchers that have gone complete games, these guys, I mean, they've Wheeler, Nola, Suarez, and Sanchez have a 2.34 ERA and 305 innings. They keep going 7+ in an era where we see max effort guys going 4 or 5 innings. What does it mean for a defensive player when you guys have guys dealing like that in front of you on the mound?
You love it. It's rhythm. You get a rhythm, and you want to be the guy to make the play. I certainly love that in center field, the steal hits. And I think the fact that it sets up your bullpen well, so there's not this constant stress factor of like, oh my goodness, he went 3 innings. He intentionally went 3 innings, and they're like, what's this train gonna be, right? One after the other, where something could possibly go wrong because it's just you need 5, 6 guys to close out a game. I think there's a lot of confidence. There's also a feeling of, you have that starter that wants the ball. There's a little edge to that. Like, yeah, I want to get him back in the dugout. I want to get him back on the mound to put up another 0, and then we get a chance to hit, and that's his mission. So there's a lot of positive of guys that just go deep. I mean, first of all, it's just clearly connects to your bullpen. You could line up your bullpen the way you want them, the way their strengths work. You could save people, and you could have days where you can assign the right matchups. So when you look at the whole series as the structure, then all of a sudden you see that what happens in game 1 matters to game 2 and 3. And when you only go 4 innings, it's a big difference between that and 7. And you can save guys. It happened like last week, I think it was the Phillies, where they didn't have to use, when Ranger Suarez had his start where he got hit in the hand, they didn't have to use their high leverage guys. That was amazing. And that just gave them more for the next 2 games, the next 3 games. So that is what the Phillies have done really well. And defensively, you love it.
Look, we could talk Phillies all day, but the reason that we wanted to have you on is not because of you being a ball player, announcer. It's the author. And it's the reason that we love having you on the show is the insight that you're able to give us and give American society. You wrote an article this past week on the Negro Leagues and the merger statistics. What it was a surprise to a lot of us that they decided to do this merger statistics. Did you see this coming, and what do you consider the biggest benefit to this?
Well, I knew that this was something that was discussed, coming out of 2020, because 2020 created the platform to make the case even stronger, because you always say, oh well, they only played 60 and 80 game seasons. Well, so that's what happened in 2020. And once those stats mattered and they became official, it was a lot harder argument to talk about statistical anomalies and small sample sizes and all these things. So I think that was something that I was aware of. And I knew the research team, Clara Smith and John Thorne, and the many that were kind of part of figuring it out were at work. I just didn't know where and when it was going to come together. So it did finally come together. And I think what's important about it is, I mentioned in the article, like it's really like a gift to Major League Baseball. It's not like, oh, we're doing you a favor and acknowledging you, even though, like, yes, that is important. And it is important to recognize it's, took a while, but at the same time, you look at that history and the richness of what the Negro Leagues represented, pre-Jackie Robinson, post-Jackie Robinson. You see the incredible fabric of America in many ways, and I would argue the best of America, because you have entrepreneurship, you have people that were denied opportunity just because of their identities and found ways to be self-empowering. They ran businesses around it. And, and I think one of the challenges, even in larger society, you're like, well, just build it, right? Well, we know there's build it and they will come from the field of dreams, but there's history, whether Tulsa is a good example of build it and it might get burned down, or build it and people might steal it, like the fashion industry in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. So it's not a foregone conclusion that you make yourself into the best, you do everything you're supposed to do with the opportunities in front of you, and you get rewarded for it. So what baseball is now absorbing in certain ways, and hopefully not to its disappearance, because that's kind of what happened with Jackie Robinson broke in. The Negro Leagues kind of started its decline, right? So because a lot of the talent followed, and so you want to also make it a fair shake that now we're coming as mutuals, we're merging in certain ways, so that you have an opportunity to tell those histories and bring them together, which is an inspiring history in many ways of survival and empowerment and all these things that came with segregation and all these the laws of the land, so to speak. So I think it's a great opportunity to not just say, well, statistically now Josh Gibson's at the top. Let's talk about like Josh Gibson's journey. Let's talk about that. And when you get those stories, it's moving and powerful. And I may make the case that it's inspiring and it's something that makes baseball stronger.
Can you talk about the value of that recognition in terms of cultural pride, in terms of people recognizing that the people that were like them now hold those statistics, that those are the leaders that you looked for as you were growing up, and now all of a sudden, a few weeks ago we interviewed somebody about the Hank Aaron book, and we talked about everything that he had to overcome, and even though he overcame so much and so much prejudice, he still didn't get the recognition, even though he had the statistics to go with that. Can you talk about the value of that recognition?
Well, the word that I always come back to is humanity. You could talk about our history as we, integrated and came through civil rights acts and basically our ongoing trying to make this a more perfect union about accepting all people and seeing everybody as equals, and not just in a spiritual sense, but in a very also on a legal sense, and all these different layers that reflect a society. And there's so much power in bringing that humanity to the forefront to say this is important for all these other reasons. It's really where baseball leaves the field, right? Leaves the playing field and expands out to its impact beyond. And if you really want to acknowledge what Jackie Robinson represented, then you realize that, yeah, this is way bigger than a game, right? This is, you guys, your show. It is the heart of sports, because at the heart, you realize that, wow, this is all beyond those white lines. This is significant. And so Hank Aaron, there was a generation of players that came after Jackie that were like, well, what do we do? Right? Like, Civil Rights Act's coming. It's not here yet. We're kind of working towards it. Some people say we've already made it. It's done. You're full citizens. Are you? And all these things started to acknowledge that there was work to be done. And so, yes, it's a big step, but I think the key thing I emphasize is it's of equals, right? It's a merger of equals. And the fact that sometimes one group of people or one institution holds the candle to decide your worth, that's part of the problem. That has been part of the problem.
One of my concerns with this, if there's any, is the loss of that history. When I've been in Kansas City to the Negro Leagues Hall of Fame, it's something that anybody in this country, regardless of you like baseball or not, should go to. Do you have any concerns that with the merger of the statistics, that maybe that history gets lost, because that history is so important?
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely concerns. And I think part of it is it's not even getting lost. It's revised. It's rose-colored glasses. It's like credit. It's all these things that can certainly happen. And we don't have to look far to know that that's happened throughout history. That's why it's called his story. You're just telling your story, and you could paint this picture and get amnesia about what happened. And I think I'd like to see more, like, we should lean into these stories. It doesn't have to denigrate anybody or make someone feel bad or their ancestor. It's like, this is important because we can actually come together and be like, yeah, this is a great story of inspiration. We found a way to overcome, and we leaned into the pain, but we see the pleasure of it. We see the joy. We see what it's like when we played in the game as a tribute to the East-West Classic. We played with joy because we had the privilege to do that on the shoulders of many who came before. And because we knew who they were, we were inspired. Like that, it doesn't have to be negative, you know, you can turn it to this incredible positive. So there is concern because of what's happened historically. As I mentioned with Jackie Robinson, the Negro League faltered within the next 15 years, 10 to 15 years, the Negro League was gone. And it wasn't necessarily a fair trade. Like, hey, you give up all this self-actualization, you give all this up and lose all your businesses for this kind of higher good, greater good that we don't necessarily have to give up anything. And that's not a fair exchange. And I think that you have to be mindful of that as possibly where this could go. So you hope that more than just the Negro League Museum and more than baseball, that story is amplified and told and just woven as part of, you know, our history. And I think that's something that could be a great thing.
And I think that people don't really understand how successful the Negro Leagues was. This was a successful endeavor. This wasn't just like a side baseball league.
Yeah, well, the word I think about, you know, you'll hear this, let's say an affirmative action argument, right? It's like qualified, right? In air quotes. But who gets to decide who's qualified? What does qualified mean? And history may have shown that, well, this person got the job and they weren't quote qualified or whatever. So you have this kind of debate about sometimes semantics, right? About like, what does this actually mean? And so, yeah, you recognize that these leagues, I mean, when you are able to share that history, you see the excellence. I mean, just think of it this way, like, okay, who came out of the Negro Leagues? Well, let's just look at that. And then what was the next generation of ball players? Well, you have, whether you have Willie Mays or Hank Aaron or these great players, obviously you have Ernie Banks and Billy Williams. And it's like, okay, so wait, if somebody was completely unqualified, and why in the world within the next generation, you have some of the greatest players to ever play the game? That's pretty hard to do. And someone, unless you're building something that's rich and deep and beyond baseball, is successful in a business sense. You have to give them a field to play. So from that generation, you came with these incredibly great players that really are still one of the greatest players to ever play baseball. And I think that says a lot.
Jeff and I have talked with different guests about the failures of some of their leagues to embrace their history, whether it's football and the breaking of the color barrier, and now baseball with the integration of the Negro Leagues. You know, you look at the season, my son now knows what ALS is because there was an ALS day in Lou Gehrig. He knows who Jackie Robinson is because everybody wore 42. What else can baseball do to embrace and integrate the history into the current game so that people understand how we got here more?
Well, I like some of the things that Major League Baseball is doing. I mean, I like the the game at Rickwood Field that they're kind of bringing back the history of the stadium and all the stories that were told within those walls. Part of it is, you know, one thing we were talking a lot over that weekend when I was at the Hall of Fame, and it's like, well, there's all these other stories that aren't aren't these great players, right? There's so many other players that were part of this, and you didn't have to be great to have a great impact, because just by standing out there and enduring what you may have endured, you meant a lot to change, you know. And Jackie Robinson or any of these players could not have done it by themselves. Their excellence on the field was never enough to just be like, oh, you're my equal, or yeah, this is fine. It took a whole lot more than that. It took the NAACP, it took the legal, it took, you know, Martin Luther King, it took, you know, all kinds of people and many allies. It didn't have to be just people of color or people who are Black. There's a lot of other people that believed in this. So there's no doubt that, you know, baseball needs to continue to lean into that. And I look, there's a Jackie Robinson, so to speak, on every team, but there's also many other stories of change that happened through the players, to the game, and through those that were part of the organization. So and it's just history, you know. You dig, you present it, and like you said, in the current game, I think it's something like MLB The Show, the game, and having the Negro League game. And I know, like, I remember talking to Bob Kendrick at the Negro League Museum, and he's like, kids will come here 8 years old and they know what pitches Satchel Paige has because they played it on MLB The Show. I mean, that's a smart way to kind of be in modernity and work your way and continue to engage on these topics.
You know, the stat heads are trying to make an argument that you can't compare the two, that merging the statistics, regardless of the benefit to the game and to society, that you can't merge the two because of the, as you alluded to briefly at the beginning, the number of games that they played in each league. What do you say to those people?
Well, you look back in time and think of all kinds of examples of, when the committee met in 1969 and they went back and looked at, all these other leagues back to whatever, 1876. There's all kinds of conditions that were different in different time periods. And numbers are not the only way to make that comparison. And yeah, I realize it can be imperfect. I think we all know numbers are imperfect, but baked into numbers are certain kinds of biases. And that's hard to, and when you think of yourself as like a pure statistician and you think that's impossible, but of course there's bias. And when you step away from baseball and you go into housing and many other, economies in our country, you see exactly how you can be thinking you're comparing the same thing and trying to do the best you can and how difficult it is when you think of like, all right, I'm going to apply for housing, but I never had a generation before me live in a situation where they weren't discriminated against to get a house. So how do I have a credit report when you didn't even give me a credit report? Like when you didn't even give me credit, right? So I don't know where you actually fix that, but you got to do something. You got to find something as inelegant as it can be to start somewhere, because these men played, and women played, and they mattered and they counted. And the reason they didn't matter and count is because society deemed them inferior and less than to even matter enough to let alone transcend the sort of humanity of it, but to transcend just basic numbers. And so, yeah, you find all kinds of reasons where you can dismiss numbers. But if you went back and said, well, we could have done this right the first place, you had an opportunity after slavery ended to be like, okay, you know what? Let's like, and we did for a while, and then Jim Crow. That was your chance to be like, hey, we're all in this together. And people said, no, just because you're Black, we're going to bury you for the next generation and generations. Well, you know what? Now baseball is doing what they can to remedy that. And then when you look at that and how hard it is to synthesize, you're seeing the story of inequity. And that's okay. But we have to talk about that and figure out, like, you're going to have these very difficult pieces. But take 100 years from now, you look back and be like, that was the right thing to do. And, and for many deeper levels than just the numbers and the purity of the number.
Doug, we always appreciate your opinion and your thoughts and the way that you approach history and the way that you're able to educate people. We always talk about all the different titles you had, all the different things that you've done. The real question that we need to answer as we go into the future is, can you add ambassador to bring together Hall and Oates?
Man, I definitely would love to be that. I would love to be that. And I don't know what's going to go down there, but I will say this. My writing, I'm getting back into my writing mode, kind of bang my head against that wall for long enough. So I'm eventually going to have a Substack, and I'll let you guys know. But so one of the things I've been writing and working on is the Hall and Oates ultimate piece. And it's really hard because I keep writing it and starting over and writing it because I want to get it like perfect, and it's impossible. But I think I'm hoping this will create at least some different understanding. But most importantly, what I'm trying to write, it's kind of for them, is like, this is what you meant to me personally. Many others share that, but this is what you meant. And I think it's a different point of view because I'm kind of looking at the identity side of it, right? You have a group from Pennsylvania that, kind of crossed over the track, so to speak, and created this sort of Black-white musical fusion. And it was inspired by the Temptations and many historically Black groups. And but they also had a lot of other musical sensibilities, and they harmonized in a way that brought all these chords and genres together. It's a really, powerful story of how they found their sound and developed it. So I think within that, here I was, this Black kid from New Jersey, hearing Kiss on my list on the radio, and pretty much feeling sure that this is a black band, you know. so I'm like, and then Friday Night Videos comes on. I'm like, wait a minute, who's that? so I was like, oh, that's great. And then it was like, that was the moment of like, I'm going to lean into this. Like, this is great. And, you know, my hometown was very diverse. And I think I want to tell that story because it's a one of joy and positive. And I think it's a really powerful thing for beyond music. And so I think for them to hear it in that way, I think it's going to really be interesting, and maybe, you know, give them just a different perspective about what they actually meant for so long to so many people.
Well, I know that Jeff hopes it works. I certainly hope it works too. And we can't wait to read it once you have your Substack out. We also hope you get to see some really good baseball in London, that the Phillies win. Doug Glanville, thanks for always giving us some time to break it down, and also for always making sure that you educate us so that we can have very good conversations out there about what has to happen.
No, thanks for having me on, guys. And look, I learned a ton from you guys. Great questions as always. Makes you think. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Doug.